She reigned for 64 years. She became known as the grandmother of Europe. But Queen Victoria was secretly responsible for spreading a deadly disease across the continent. The single gene she carried would plague the thrones of Spain and Germany. It would ultimately devastate the future of the Russian Romanov dynasty. For 40 years, the public saw a symbol of moral gravity, a widow in perpetual black. They revered the face of the British Empire. They never saw the woman who, in private, called women's suffrage a mad and wicked folly, or the fact that she was a skilled politician who secretly ran the government from behind palace doors. Her vision was simple: use royal blood to guarantee world peace. Instead, the alliances she built proved to be a fatal paradox. In the end, 3 of her own grandsons would lead the rival nations that ignited the First World War. How did the woman who personified an entire age become the one who set the stage for its destruction? On June 20th, 1837, the UK's King William IV died at Windsor Castle. It was a massive change. Since 1760, King George III and his sons had pretty much been in charge. Now, the crown was going to a totally new generation. The heir was an 18-year-old girl named Victoria, George III's granddaughter and the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. This was the first time in almost 125 years that Britain would have a queen. People probably figured, given how young she was, that Victoria would be around for a while. But no one could have guessed that thanks to 19th century medical advances and her own long life, she'd rule for the entire rest of the 19th century. Her name would totally define the era when the British Empire was at its peak, a global superpower with influence stretching from New Zealand all the way to British Columbia. It's funny, but when people talk about the Victorian era, they often forget about Victoria herself. Who was she, really? What did she think about her job? Was she cool with being the face of Britain when it was so powerful everywhere? This is the story of Queen Victoria, the woman whose empire literally never saw the sun set. The woman we know as Queen Victoria was born on May 24th, 1819, right there at Kensington Palace in London. Her mom was Princess Victoria Marie Louise of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, from the royal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in what's now East Central Germany. She was the daughter of a duke and a countess, and she'd been married before to Charles, Prince of Leiningen, a small state in modern Bavaria. After her first husband died in 1814, she was the regent for her young son, Karl. In 1818, Princess Victoria stepped down as regent to marry again, this time to Britain's Prince Edward. Victoria's dad was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathern, the 4th son of King George III. Edward was from the House of Hanover, a royal family line from northern Germany. His dad was king of both Britain and Hanover, though George III never actually visited Hanover and spoke English as his main language. When they tied the knot in 1818, Princess Victoria became the Duchess of Kent, and they had just one kid, Victoria. Her father died of pneumonia in 1820, just 8 months after she was born. Victoria's mom gave birth to the future queen at 4:14 a.m. in the dining room of Kensington Palace. A bit of a weird spot, but it made sense. Hot water was easy to bring up from the kitchen. She was also delivered by a female doctor, Charlotte Heidenreich von Siebold, which was pretty unusual back then, and who, funnily enough, also delivered her future husband, Prince Albert. When she was born, Victoria was 5th in line for the British crown. She was privately christened by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles Manners Sutton, on June 24th, 1819, in the cupola room at Kensington Palace. She was baptized Alexandrina Victoria. Alexandrina after one of her godparents, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and Victoria after her mother. Her official title was Her Royal Highness, Princess Victoria of Kent. She was described as a serious, thoughtful, and studious kid, traits that really help her out when she became queen in 1837. The House of Hanover, Victoria's family, had ruled Britain since 1714. The first 2 Hanoverian kings, George I and George II, ruled as King of Great Britain and Ireland, plus the separate title of King of Hanover. But Victoria's grandfather, George III, was the first to rule the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland after the official union of the two kingdoms on January 1st, 1801. Like all their predecessors since the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Hanoverians were constitutional monarchs. That basically meant their power was limited, with lawmaking in the hands of the elected House of Commons and the House of Lords. Hanoverian Britain was a bit of an outlier in Europe, where absolute monarchies were common. Victoria's grandfather, George III, had seen massive changes in Britain and the world. Under him, the British Empire began a rapid expansion that would reach its peak under Victoria, even though many of Britain's North American colonies were lost when the United States won its freedom after the American War of Independence. Fighting in Europe calmed down after multiple wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, wrapping up with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815. The Hanoverian era brought industrialization and huge social transformation to Britain and the world. Great minds like engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, first computer inventor Charles Babbage, and telephone inventor Alexander Graham Bell all lived during this time. Brunel, especially, kept the Industrial Revolution moving. Through the early 19th century, he built the roads, railways, and the first all-iron steamship, the SS Great Britain, linking up Britain's industry and trade networks. Before Victoria took the throne in 1837, goods and people moved around Britain by stagecoach, averaging a sluggish 12 kilometers per hour. During her reign, railway construction kicked into high gear, speeding this up to 30 kilometers per hour by the 1830s and a speedy 80 kilometers per hour by the 1850s. Raw materials arrived in Britain on steamships, feeding the busy cotton mills up north and bringing new and exotic goods to the British market. Britain was changing face. Agriculture and imports supported a massive population boom, from 11 million at the start of the 19th century to 37 million by the end of Victoria's reign in 1901. This growing population moved more and more into cities, living in the expanding industrial towns and working in the factories, mills, and mines that powered the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the Victorian era, Britain's towns, streets, and factories were bustling and looked pretty similar, thanks to cheap imported building materials. Town planning had to catch up to the huge influx of people. By 1900, pavements and street lighting had made many towns much better, and most new homes had electricity, running water, drainage, indoor toilets, and gas for cooking. With industrial progress came demands for social change. Trade unions became the voice for exploited workers, and campaigners started pushing for political reform. Although women still couldn't vote, several political reforms passed during Victoria's reign opened up politics. Secret voting was introduced in 1872 to prevent voter intimidation, and laws were passed to stop the bribing of voters in 1883. However, MPs weren't paid until 1911, meaning working-class men couldn't get elected to Parliament without financial help from donors or trade unions. Education improved when, in the 1870s, the government took responsibility for educating children aged 5 to 10. By 1900, 90% of children regularly attended school, though kids in rural areas were often pulled out to help with the harvest. Religion was also a big topic of debate in Parliament at this time, particularly about laws controlling what people could do on Sundays. New churches kept being built, and not just for the Church of England. Catholic churches also went up as religious tolerance grew. But beneath all the progress, innovation, and wealth, Victoria's Britain, and that of her Hanoverian predecessors, was a place with harsh poverty laws, rampant crime, overly harsh punishments, pollution, prostitution, slums, and begging. Victoria herself was deeply conservative socially and believed people shouldn't try to move out of the class they were born into. She even opposed giving women the vote, calling the idea a mad and wicked folly. It was during Victoria's time that the British Navy ruled the seas and the British Empire reached its zenith. The Victorian age would be remembered as a golden time for Britain. At her birth, it seemed unlikely Victoria would ever become queen. She was only fifth in line, but by the time she turned 18, she was the heir, thanks to the rapid deaths of her relatives. When Victoria was born, her uncle George, Prince of Wales, was acting as regent because King George III was suffering from a debilitating mental illness that worsened near the end of his reign. Her uncle ruled as regent for 9 years and finally took the throne in 1820 as King George IV. Even after the death of the ailing George III, the British monarchy's troubles were far from over. George IV had secretly and illegally married the Catholic widow Maria and Fitzherbert in 1785. Any children they had would not be considered legitimate. So, George was eventually persuaded to marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795. This second marriage, though legal and approved by the public and elites, was not a happy one. The couple had one child, a daughter named Princess Charlotte, before they separated, causing a public scandal. George IV was already unpopular due to his spoilt nature, greed, and irresponsible behavior. Then, in 1817, George IV's only legitimate daughter, Princess Charlotte, died while giving birth to a stillborn son. 2 generations of heirs were gone, sparking a desperate race among the king's unmarried brothers to produce a legitimate heir. The second oldest brother, Frederick, Duke of York, had already married Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia, but they had no children, and Frederick died in 1827. The third brother, William, Duke of Clarence, later King William IV, ended his long-term relationship with his mistress and married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. After Frederick's death, William was next in line, and any legitimate children he had would be his heirs, ahead of his younger brother, Edward, the fourth son. But William had no legitimate children. Victoria's father, Edward, Duke of Kent, was George III's fourth son, and he quickly married Victoria's mother, Princess Victoria, in 1818 to continue the line of succession. The widowed Victoria already had 2 children from her first marriage. Her daughter, Princess Feodora, would become Victoria's beloved half-sister and companion. Upon her birth, Victoria took her place in the line of succession behind her uncle William IV, any of his surviving children, and her own father. At 8 months old, Victoria's world was shaken when her father died suddenly in January 1820. The family was left with large debts and fell under the controlling hand of Sir John Conroy, Edward's equerry and an ex-officer in the Royal Household Artillery, who claimed Victoria's father had asked him to look after his widowed wife and child. When she turned 4, Victoria started her education under the Reverend George Davis. Her new tutor was said to be patient and polite and encouraged her talents. She followed a strict timetable of lessons and was particularly good at languages, learning to speak French, German, Italian, and Latin, in addition to the English she spoke at home. She also had the benefit of a singing teacher, the opera singer Luigi Lablache, and drawing lessons from the respected painter Richard Westall. A tough education wasn't the only difficulty in Victoria's childhood. Her life was rigidly controlled by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and John Conroy. Her mother grew increasingly reliant on the controlling Conroy, partly because she wasn't fluent in English. Conroy was highly ambitious and used his influence over the Duchess and Victoria, hoping to control the throne. This strategy would have worked especially well if Victoria had become queen before age 18, requiring her mother to act as regent. The Regency Act of 1830 had arranged for Victoria's mother to rule as regent if King William IV died before Victoria reached adulthood, a decision that annoyed William, as he didn't trust the Duchess. Conroy started trying to boost the popularity of the Duchess, who wasn't well-liked by the wider royal family. Strict rules were put in place for the royal household, especially for Victoria. These rules became known as the Kensington system. Because of these rules, Victoria grew up isolated and naive. Any hint of independence was discouraged, and she was constantly watched. She wasn't allowed her own bedroom and had to sleep on a small bed in her mother's room. She wasn't even permitted to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand, just in case she fell. Victoria later described her childhood at Kensington Palace as isolating and demoralizing. Given this isolation, the child Victoria had very few friends and had to entertain herself. Some of Victoria's favorite childhood pastimes included drawing, writing stories, and making costumes for her doll collection with her beloved governess, Baroness Lezen. She also kept a diary and wrote over 60 million words in her lifetime. She spent hours playing alone or with her little dog, the King Charles Spaniel Dash, even having trousers made for him. She referred to this time as one of the loneliest of her life, with only her equally loved governess and her dog for company. Although Victoria grew to resent her isolation and the rules Conroy created, they unintentionally worked in her favor. Her mother and Conroy's attempts to keep her weak and dependent by isolating her from people they deemed undesirable, including her father's family, and especially King William IV, who had several illegitimate children, backfired. Her absence from court meant she wasn't associated with her unpopular uncles and predecessors, George IV and William IV. Also, archival research by the Historic Royal Palace's curators suggests that Victoria's later memory of her unhappy childhood might be inaccurate. There's plenty of evidence that her mother loved her deeply and spoiled Victoria. She was surrounded by her beloved governess and supportive tutors. She even enjoyed trips to the coast, the theater, and the ballet, which she loved the most. She also went on several royal tours around the country between 1830 and 1835. An avid writer, she recorded these excursions and noted her impressions of the country. She wrote of her shock after seeing the Black Country in the West Midlands, named for the smog caused by iron making and coal mining. On one of her earliest trips, the country is very desolate everywhere. Smoking and burning coal heaps intermingled with wretched huts and carts and little ragged children. Much to William IV's annoyance, Victoria was greeted warmly by crowds of people at every stop on her journeys. William disliked how these tours seemed to present Victoria as his rival rather than his heir, comparing them to royal progresses, a medieval royal tour where the king would be greeted with formal ceremonies and festivals in every town he stopped in. Victoria also disliked these tours, partly because they were exhausting and partly because of William's disapproval, but her mother forced her to continue them. In 1835, Conroy made his biggest move to solidify control over the future queen. During another tour, Victoria got a severe fever while at Ramsgate, a seaside town in southeast England. Conroy and her mother took advantage of her weakened state to pressure her into making Conroy her private secretary. But Victoria held firm, just as she had during all of Conroy's previous attempts to get an official position on her staff. As her uncle, the king, finally neared the end of his life, Victoria was seen as the nation's hope. She emerged from her isolation and the strict rules of her mother and Conroy as a bright new prospect, a fresh start for the monarchy. On June 20th, 1837, Victoria was woken up early at 6 a.m. to receive unexpected visitors at Kensington Palace who were bringing important news. She went downstairs and, unusually, saw these visitors alone and still in her dressing gown. Chief among them was Lord Conyngham, the Lord Chamberlain and most senior officer of the royal household, who told her that her uncle, the king, had died at 2:12 a.m. Victoria was now queen, and at age 18, she was old enough to rule by herself. One of the very first things Victoria did was have her bed moved out of her mother's bedroom. This wasn't the only step she took to break free from her mother and Conroy's influence. That day, the day of her accession, Victoria dressed in black mourning clothes for her uncle and made her first public appearance, as queen alone, confidently stepping out of her mother's shadow. Her first official appearance was a success. 97 counselors, cabinet ministers, and officials arrived in the Red Saloon at Kensington Palace for their first meeting with the new queen. The Duke of Wellington later described this gathering of the Accession Council and noted that despite the new queen's small size, Victoria was only 5 feet 1 inch. She had not only filled her chair, she filled the room. Buoyed by the success of her first appearance, Victoria set about asserting her authority and creating a new life for herself. She fled the confinement of the Kensington system and left Kensington Palace altogether for Buckingham Palace, which became her main residence. She dismissed Conroy and kept her mother at a distance by installing her in a faraway apartment in Buckingham Palace and later in a house in Belgrave Square. Her governess, Baroness Lezen, was invited to live in Buckingham Palace as Victoria's companion. It was around this time that Victoria dropped her first name, Alexandrina, and went solely by Victoria. Despite her outward confidence, Victoria did admit to feeling nervous on her coronation day. Held on June 28, 1838, the coronation brought thousands of people out onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the young new queen. Victoria later wrote in her diary that the sight of the cheering and waving crowd from her carriage calmed her nerves. "How proud I felt to be queen of such a nation." The coronation itself didn't go perfectly smoothly. The bishop fumbled his lines and called the ceremony to an end too early. An elderly peer had a fall, and the coronation ring was placed on the wrong finger. But the delighted public didn't dwell on these mishaps, as they enjoyed fireworks and a fair at Hyde Park, as well as free access to theaters across London. As with many important moments in Victoria's reign, effort was made to allow the public a view of the monarch and a chance to celebrate the monarchy. Unlike her coronation, Victoria's first year as queen passed without any major mistakes. Her youth and distance from her unpopular predecessors encouraged a very positive view of her reign. Many people looked forward to a new, hopeful era under her rule. Her small stature, youth, inexperience, and gender led people to underestimate her. Her gender had prevented her from taking the throne of Hanover, which her predecessors had held, because ancient Salic law excluded women from the Hanoverian succession. Instead, her father's unpopular younger brother, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, became King of Hanover, as well as Victoria's heir until she had a child. But Victoria was determined to succeed as Britain's monarch, writing in her diary, "I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young, and perhaps in many, although not all things, inexperienced, but I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have." Her rosy first year was followed by a tougher second one, partly because she relied too heavily on her favorite ministers and advisors, particularly Prime Minister Lord Melbourne of the Whig Party and King Leopold of Belgium. Victoria's dependence on Melbourne and their close relationship led to rumors that the new queen was under the Prime Minister's influence, and even that they were having a secret romantic relationship, despite a large 40-year age gap. A rumor that has never been proven. It seems more likely that the inexperienced Victoria looked to Melbourne for advice and saw him as a father figure. Since Melbourne was a widower and childless, many, including aristocrat and diarist Charles Greville, noted that he was passionately fond of her, as he might be of his daughter, if he had one. In 1839, two political scandals threatened to damage Victoria's reputation. The first was a court drama involving Lady Flora Hastings, a lady-in-waiting to Victoria's mother, who was rumored to be expecting an illegitimate child with Conroy. An abdominal growth, later proven in a post-mortem to be a large liver tumor, fueled these rumors. Victoria, who deeply resented Conroy and her mother for her restricted childhood, believed the rumors and demanded proof. Lady Flora initially refused an intimate medical examination, only agreeing to one in February, which proved she was a virgin. The Hastings family, Conroy, and the opposing Tories turned the press against the Queen, claiming she had spread false rumors about Lady Flora, and Victoria was booed during public appearances. To make matters worse, another political scandal quickly followed: the bedchamber crisis of 1839. Lord Melbourne had resigned as Prime Minister after the Liberal Radicals and Tories voted against a bill to suspend the Constitution of Jamaica. The bill passed by a narrow majority and removed political power from the plantation owners who had resisted the abolition of slavery. A Tory government was to be formed under Robert Peel. But Victoria's refusal to allow Peel to appoint her ladies of the bedchamber, as was the political custom, caused a crisis when Peel refused to govern under the restrictions Victoria imposed. Melbourne returned to office, and many questioned Victoria's ability to rule as a constitutional monarch, a figure who should remain separate from Parliament's politics. When support for Melbourne finally ran out in the House of Commons in 1841, the ladies of the bedchamber most associated with the Whigs were replaced as Peel became Prime Minister following the 1841 general election. Just as her mother and Conroy's dominance had faded, Lord Melbourne's influence over Victoria was also coming to an end. Her next confidant and chief political advisor would have the greatest impact on her life and reign. Her husband, German Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria and Prince Albert first met in May 1836. Albert, who was also Victoria's cousin, was invited to visit Kensington Palace by Victoria's mother, encouraged by his uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. A marriage between them had been planned by their families almost since birth, despite King William IV's disapproval. He had wanted to avoid another Coburg royal match and preferred Prince Alexander of the Netherlands as a suitor. Victoria and Albert had already become friends during Albert's visit in 1836, but it wasn't until 1839 that Victoria decided she was ready for marriage. On November 23, 1839, Victoria summoned the Privy Council to Buckingham Palace to announce her intention to marry Albert. She had carefully evaluated the parade of eligible princes sent her way and concluded that Albert was extremely handsome with a most delightful countenance. She had already written to Albert's uncle, King Leopold, at age 17, before she was ready for marriage, thanking him for the prospect of great happiness you have contributed to give me in the person of dear Albert. He possesses every quality that could be desired to render me perfectly happy. Victoria's decision to marry Albert was complicated. As queen, love couldn't be the only reason for marriage. Though Victoria did love Albert, she decided to marry partly because she needed support with her royal responsibilities and partly to win public approval. When she proposed to Albert on October 15, 1839, as royal protocol demanded, Victoria gushed at his acceptance. The couple embraced, and Victoria later wrote joyfully in her diary, "Oh, how I adore and love him, I cannot say." Victoria and Albert's wedding on February 10, 1840, was a public event. It was the first royal wedding planned with public enjoyment in mind. The people of London got a glimpse of Queen Victoria in an open carriage on her way to the ceremony at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a fashionable white satin court dress instead of royal robes, appearing as a woman as well as a queen. This style has been copied by brides ever since. She also wore an orange blossom wreath over her veil, a brooch made by Albert, and Turkish diamond earrings and a necklace. Prince Albert wore the uniform of a British field marshal. Photographs were taken of the happy couple in their wedding clothes and shared widely. Victoria's wedding, the white dress, the carriage ride through the streets, the cheering crowds, set the standard for all future royal weddings involving the direct line of royal descent. A fanfare of trumpets announced the bride's procession. Lord Melbourne headed the procession, with the Queen following on the arm of her uncle, Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, who took the place of her late father. Victoria was thrilled with her marriage. It became a true love match. She wrote in her diary that her wedding day had been the happiest day of my life. The couple enjoyed a short but sweet honeymoon and proceeded happily into married life together. Despite Victoria's status as queen, both Albert and Victoria were traditionalists. They both believed the man should be the dominant one in any marriage. Yet, Albert proved to be a devoted husband, and Victoria's first pregnancy in 1840 helped to ease the situation. As her pregnancy progressed, Albert supported her, reading her the daily government dispatches when she wasn't well enough to get up. They worked closely together on side-by-side desks at Buckingham Palace, and Albert gradually became, in effect, Victoria's private secretary, taking on more of her responsibilities as she neared the end of her pregnancy and began increasingly focusing on motherhood and family. Albert had encouraged Victoria to work on improving her relationship with her mother. And it was while the pregnant Victoria and Albert were on their way to visit the Duchess that 18-year-old Edward Oxford attempted to assassinate her as she passed in her carriage. Oxford's gun was fired twice, but either the bullets missed or, as he later claimed, the gun wasn't loaded. He was tried for high treason, found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, committed to an insane asylum, and later deported to Australia. In the aftermath of the attack, Victoria's popularity soared, and the Hastings affair and bedchamber crisis were forgotten. But this assassination attempt and Oxford's acquittal encouraged further attacks, including in 1842, 1849, 1850, 1872, and 1882. Later in life, Victoria showed great bravery when, after dodging an assassination attempt while riding along the Mall in London on May 29, 1842, she agreed to ride out again the next day so that John Francis, the would-be assassin, could be lured out and caught in the act by plainclothes police officers. But Victoria's popularity among her subjects was most rooted in her motherhood and the perfect image of the royal family she created. Victoria and Albert were devoted parents and were thrilled by the arrival of their first child, Princess Victoria, or Vicky. Their family quickly grew despite the difficulties Victoria experienced during pregnancy. Their first child, Vicky, was followed by Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Victoria suffered postnatal depression after many of her pregnancies and strongly disliked breastfeeding. By the time of her 8th and 9th pregnancies, she promoted the use of chloroform for pain relief, despite protests from the clergy who saw it as going against biblical teachings and some members of the medical profession who thought it was dangerous. The royal couple shared a great interest in their children and took great pleasure in raising and educating them. They presented an image of a happy family to the world, sharing their joy on holidays and birthdays through the new illustrated newspapers. Albert took an active role in parenting, spending lots of time playing with his children, unlike many aristocratic fathers of the time. Victoria happily described her husband's wonderful relationship with their children in her diary. He is so kind to them and romps with them delightfully. Albert created joyful scenes of domestic Christmases, popularizing festive traditions such as decorating a Christmas tree, which are still part of present-day British homes. The image of the happy domestic royal family added to Victoria's popularity. She became a symbol of marital harmony and domestic bliss, widely known to be driven by strong moral convictions, which made her very popular with the rising middle classes. Her financial responsibility meant she successfully paid off her father's debts, and she ran a relatively simple home for a royal, in sharp contrast to the extravagance of her predecessors. Victoria realized that public opinion improved when she openly devoted herself to her children, and letting Albert take over some of her royal duties proved to be a smart move. Upon their marriage, Albert had been granted the formal title of HRH Prince Albert, but he was popularly known as HRH Prince Consort, a title Victoria formalized on June 29, 1857. The effective working partnership between Victoria and Albert was summed up by Charles Greville in 1845 when he wrote, "They are one person, and he likes and she dislikes business." Albert aimed to create a new, powerful role as Prince Consort. Recognizing a rival influence over his wife, Albert persuaded Victoria to send her confidant, Baroness Lesen, back to Germany for a quiet retirement. After Prime Minister Melbourne's death in 1842, Victoria became completely dependent on Albert. Albert's wise guidance and connections proved invaluable to Victoria, but she still took ownership of decisions that were important to her. As the Great Famine ravaged Ireland, killing over 1 million people and displacing another million, Victoria was denounced as the Famine Queen in Ireland. In January 1847, she donated £2,000 of her personal money to the British Relief Association, an amount worth several million in today's money, the largest donation made by any individual. She supported the repeal of the Corn Laws, which were keeping the price of grain artificially high and worsening the devastating impact of the famine for Irish people. She bravely ignored Protestant opposition to support the increase of an annual grant from the British government to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, a run-down Catholic seminary in Ireland. Later, rumors of Victoria's cold indifference to the Irish plight and the story that she had only donated £5 to the relief and had given the same amount to the Battersea Dogs Home on the same day were completely made up. Victoria's first visit to Ireland in 1849, when the famine was almost over, was a success, though it had no lasting effect on the growth of Irish nationalism. Victoria and Albert both took a keen interest in Europe, especially in improving foreign relations between Britain and France. Victoria became the first British monarch to visit a French monarch since King Henry VIII had visited King Francis I of France in 1520. Through Albert, Victoria was related to the House of Orleans via the Coburgs and visited King Louis Philippe I in Normandy twice, in 1843 and 1845. When Louis Philippe returned the visit in 1844, he became the first French king to visit a British sovereign, and when he was deposed during the revolutions of 1848, he sought exile in England. Demonstrations in England by the Chartists and Irish nationalists failed to gain the widespread support that revolutionary movements were seeing on the European continent. Albert was also responsible for the Great Exhibition of 1851, designed as a public celebration of technological innovation and the growth of trade. Albert was very intelligent and highly interested in trade, industry, art, and science. The Great Exhibition featured over 100,000 exhibits from around the world and even displayed the famous Kohinoor diamond from India. Because Albert was socially conscious, perhaps more so than his wife, the Great Exhibition was reasonably priced to allow anyone to visit. The most expensive season ticket, 3 guineas, was equivalent to over £2,000 today, but there were also cheap day tickets available for the reasonable price of 1 shilling. Over 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition. It gave many people their first taste of the wider world and was widely praised as a huge success. Victoria herself was so captivated by her husband's project that she visited the exhibition almost every day for 3 months. The Great Exhibition also had foreign admirers. Napoleon III of France invited Victoria and Albert to the Exposition Universelle in August 1855 after visiting the royal couple in London earlier that year. They were also guests of honor at an extravagant ball at the Palace of Versailles and visited the tomb of Napoleon I on their trip. Victoria and Albert also worked to strengthen relations with Albert's German homeland. In 1858, Albert's favorite child, Vicky, their firstborn, was married at age 17 to Prince Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, the future Kaiser of Germany. The wedding took place on January 25, 1858, at the Royal Chapel of St. James's Palace in London. Albert hoped that the liberal education he had given his daughter would help her guide Prussia and later the German Empire into a liberal constitutional monarchy based on the British model. But he seriously misjudged the situation, overestimating the strength of Prussia's very small middle class and underestimating the popularity of conservatism. Vicky was not to have the happy life her father had when he married into a foreign royal family. Vicky was criticized for her overly British views on monarchy and her English origins. She was shunned by the royal house of the Hohenzollerns, the conservatives at the Berlin court, and her rising political opponent, Otto von Bismarck. As tensions grew between her childhood nation and the nation of her marriage, Vicky became very unpopular and suffered. Through the successful marriages of their 9 children, Victoria and Albert created connections with foreign royal families across the European continent. Many of Europe's thrones belonged to or were closely related to Victoria's 9 children and her 42 grandchildren. Of the 8 grandchildren their eldest child, Vicky, gave them, Sophie went on to marry a Greek prince, becoming Queen of Greece. The marriage of their second child, Prince Albert, Bertie, to Princess Alexandra of Denmark created connections with Denmark. And when their own child, Maud, married the King of Norway, several connections were formed with the German states, including through the marriage of their third child, Princess Alice, to Grand Duke Louis IV of the German state of Hesse. Their daughter, Alexandra, went on to marry the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. Connections with Russia had already been formed when Victoria's fourth child, Prince Alfred, married the Grand Duchess Marie, daughter of Tsar Alexander II. Their fifth child, Princess Helena, married Prince Frederick Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, further solidifying relations with the German states. However, their sixth child, Princess Louise, broke the mold by marrying a commoner, John Douglas Sutherland Campbell, who became the Duke of Argyll, a prominent MP and Governor-General of Canada. This unique marriage actually had the support of Victoria, British Prime Minister Disraeli, and the general public, as many feared yet another German marriage. Prince Arthur, child number 7 and a military enthusiast, he rose to the rank of Field Marshal, married Princess Louise Marguerite of Prussia. Their 8th child and youngest boy, Prince Leopold, married Princess Helena Frederica of Waldeck and Pyrmont, another German state. Although he died 2 years after this happy union was formed due to hemophilia, a genetic condition which spread through Victoria's network of descendants across Europe. A condition which particularly harmed the Russian royal family when the sole heir to the throne, Alexei, the son of Victoria's granddaughter, Alex, and Tsar Nicholas, was found to harbor the often deadly disease. As Victoria's husband, Albert, had died when their 9th and last child, Princess Beatrice, was 4 years old, Victoria rejected any potential suitors and kept her close as a companion. At the age of 27, Beatrice finally met her love match, Prince Henry of Battenberg, at a family wedding. And although Victoria remained opposed to the match for 8 months, the couple eventually wore her down, and they married with her blessing on the condition that they live in Britain. Their daughter Victoria would marry into the Spanish royal family, introducing the hemophilic gene into another European dynasty. Overall, Victoria and Albert had succeeded in their goal of building connections across Europe with the marriages of their 9 children and 42 grandchildren. But their goal of Europe-wide peace failed enormously as the First World War broke out, even with 3 cousins on the rival thrones of Britain, Russia, and Germany. Victoria's life and her happy family were shattered in 1861 when her mother died. Although they had not had a perfect relationship, Victoria felt immense grief when she discovered in her mother's papers that she had, in fact, deeply loved her daughter. Worse tragedy followed when the person she relied on most for support and strength, her husband Albert, also died. Albert fell ill with typhoid fever and died on December 14, 1861, at the young age of 42. Victoria was heartbroken and never truly recovered from her grief. She wrote to her uncle Leopold that, "My life as a happy one is ended. The world is gone for me." Her royal duties and the carefully crafted image of the royal domestic family came under threat. During a Privy Council meeting 3 weeks after Albert's death, Victoria was so consumed by grief that she couldn't speak. Consumed by deep grief, Victoria wore black mourning clothes and minimal jewelry for the rest of her life and withdrew from public view, which was disastrous for her public image. Her depression caused her to gain weight, which further discouraged her from making public appearances. She became very lonely and overcompensated by dominating her children's time and obsessively keeping the memory of their father alive. Victoria's seclusion led people to assume she was incapable of doing her job. She lost her confidence and avoided public appearances other than her official government duties, retreating behind the walls of her favorite royal residences, Balmoral in Scotland, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Windsor Castle. The public began to lose respect for the Queen, and some even started calling for the abolition of the monarchy. Doctors who came to see Victoria feared she was mentally ill. She remained in self-imposed seclusion until the early 1880s when her family, particularly her uncle Leopold, confidants, and Prime Minister Disraeli, finally convinced her to appear more in public. With their encouragement, she agreed to visit the gardens of the Royal Horticultural Society at Kensington and to take a drive through London in an open carriage. But it was really 2 men, John Brown and Abdul Karim, who succeeded in pulling Victoria out of her grief enough to fully repair her image and become involved in the political sphere once more. John Brown, a plain-speaking Highlander and Victoria's manservant, became one of her favorites in 1861. Victoria described his constant presence as a real comfort, but not everyone approved of his influence over the Queen. The press suggested the two were secretly married, and Brown became very unpopular within the royal household, a fact which didn't bother Victoria in the slightest. Brown helped Victoria deal with her deep grief and treated her as a woman rather than a queen. In 1866, Victoria stepped back into the political sphere, attending the state opening of Parliament for the first time since Albert's death, and openly supporting the Reform Act of 1867, which extended voting rights to many urban working men. The second of Victoria's confidants was even more unpopular with the court than John Brown. Abdul Karim was Victoria's personal servant and munshi, teacher, from India from 1887 until the end of her life. Karim perhaps attracted more prejudice and jealousy than Brown due to the prevalent ideas of racial superiority at the time, and because he was from a low social background. But as with Brown, Victoria ignored the advice and jealous murmurs of others. Karim taught Victoria the Urdu language, which she became fluent in, and about Indian culture, which fascinated her. Victoria's notes from her lessons still survive, along with many of her other writings. The Queen became increasingly interested in the British Empire in the latter part of her reign and devoted much time and energy to promoting its expansion and glorification. By the end of Victoria's reign, the British Empire covered more than a fifth of the world's land mass and included nearly 1 in 4 people, including the entire Indian subcontinent, as well as large parts of Africa and several Caribbean islands. Between 1815 and 1914, approximately 400 million people and 10 million square miles were added to the empire, most of which happened during Victoria's long reign. The wars of Victoria's era were often fought on distant shores, with the Crimean War, fought against Russia from 1854 to 1856, being an exception. It was during this war that the first Victoria Cross was awarded. It was the first official honor granted to ordinary servicemen for bravery. The British Army and Royal Navy were involved in conflicts in Afghanistan, China, India, Ghana against the Ashani people, in eastern and southern Africa against the Zulus, Egypt, and in South Africa against the Boers. Victoria was not naive about the cost of empire. She was very much in favor of expansionism and the empire and deeply approved of Prime Minister Disraeli's expansionist foreign policy. If we are to maintain our position as a first-rate power, we must be prepared for attacks and wars somewhere or other, she wrote. She saw the expansion of the British Empire as necessary for civilization and for protecting native people from aggressive rulers. On May 1, 1876, Victoria was crowned Empress of India, a title given to her by parliamentary vote, although she had been interested and involved in the ruling of India long before then. In the 1840s, she had registered her disgust at the behavior of the East India Company, a semi-private corporation that ran the British territories in India and profited hugely from trade in the region. In 1856, she wrote, "I always feel sorry for those poor deposed Indian princes." Victoria had actually met one of the men deposed by the British, Dalip Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, who had been deposed by the British in 1848 and was invited to meet Victoria and Albert in 1854 after he had converted to Christianity. Despite an attempt to return to Lahore and take back the throne in later life, he was reconciled with Victoria in 1890 when she gave him a full pardon. Victoria would become the godmother to Singh's daughter, Princess Sophia Alexandra Dalip Singh, who became a prominent English suffragette and campaigned for women's rights outside Hampton Court Palace, where Victoria had allowed her family to live. Despite her interest in India, her mastery of the Urdu language, and her friendship with Abdul Karim, Victoria never visited India. As well as her investiture as Empress of India, Victoria's popularity was restored by the extravagant celebrations of her Golden Jubilee in 1887, marking 50 years of her rule, and the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, celebrating 60 years. Her public appearances caused great excitement, and her open smile as she processed through London in an open carriage on the day of her Golden Jubilee was one of very few moments when Victoria's smile was captured on camera. But Victoria didn't forget her grief in private, writing on the day of her Golden Jubilee, "The day has come, and I am alone." By 1897, Victoria's popularity and her confidence were completely restored. She became seen as the nation's grandmother and received thousands of congratulatory messages for her Diamond Jubilee from across the world. She sent a telegraph message of thanks to her subjects. "From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them." The huge outpouring of national pride led to the era being known as Victorian Britain. The lack of major wars to fund during her reign, especially compared to the decades following her reign, and the huge new wealth generated by industry and trade resulted in a larger and more affluent middle and upper class that could afford to spend more on leisure. Town parks began to open, the first in Preston, Lancashire, and cricket, football, rugby, and athletic clubs were established. Music halls, theaters, readings, and comic operas became increasingly popular, and museums opened, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1852. For those not living in poverty, the Victorian age was truly a golden period. By 1901, at the age of 81, Victoria was becoming frail, had lost a lot of weight, and had to use a wheelchair to move around. She moved to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight for peace and to avoid the spotlight. The few people who saw her at this time said she seemed to have shrunk to half the person she had been. She suffered from osteoarthritis, a condition that made her joints painfully stiff, and her surviving dresses from this period were altered to accommodate a dowager's hump, a hump on her upper back caused by spinal collapse. The last year of Victoria's life had been hard. She had lived to see the death of her second son, Alfred, in July 1900, who had died after the suicide of his own son, the breakdown of his marriage, and excessive drinking. Her favorite grandson, Christian Victor, child of her daughter Beatrice, died in October 1900 of malaria along with his father. The sorrow perhaps shortened Victoria's life, as her companions noted that not only her stature, but also her spirit seemed to be shrinking, and she lost her appetite. Despite being nearly blind, Victoria continued to write in her diary until her last entry on January 13, 1901, when her strength began to leave her. Her first grandson, Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, rushed to her side as her death loomed, joining her son and successor, Edward VII. Victoria died on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81 in her grandson's arms on the Isle of Wight. She had ruled for almost 64 years, the longest reign of any British monarch up to that point. In keeping with the Queen's wishes, her body was dressed in a white dress and her wedding veil and brought back to London. Her funeral procession passed through streets full of mourners on its way to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where her funeral was held. Her eldest son, King Edward VII, walked behind her coffin, accompanied by her third son, Prince Arthur, and grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Her funeral was simple and respectful, as she had requested. Victoria was then laid to rest with her husband Albert at the Royal Mausoleum near Frogmore House in the grounds of Windsor Castle. She had asked for certain items to be buried with her, including some jewelry, plaster casts of her children's hands, and Albert's dressing gown. She had also secretly asked her trusted royal doctor to add a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair to her left hand. Above the mausoleum door were inscribed Victoria's words, "Farewell, best beloved, here at last I shall rest with thee. With thee in Christ I shall rise again." Victoria was the last British monarch of the House of Hanover and was succeeded by her son Edward VII of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on January 22, 1901. Victoria never believed that she, as a woman, was the best person to be monarch. She believed, like many of her contemporaries, that men made the best leaders. But by the time of her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, no one, not even Victoria herself, could doubt that a woman was capable of being the monarch. Despite several years of unpopularity when she became a reclusive widow, Victoria was immensely popular, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. She appeared to many to be a benevolent, matriarchal figure above politics. Only after her death and the release of her diaries and letters did the extent of her deep political influence become clear. Although constrained by the constitutional monarchy she represented, Victoria took advantage of her rights, the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn, as Walter Bagehot stated. And more than once, she altered the direction of policies and politicians by wielding her influence. Victoria, despite her lack of confidence, had been a skilled politician who successfully presented herself as a devoted wife and mother, which home-loving Victorians idolized. Identified with strict standards of personal morality, Victoria brought stability to a monarchy which had been rocked by a series of unreliable and often unpopular kings. She had made the monarchy more accessible, for example, by opening up her birthplace, Kensington Palace, to the public in 1899 by setting the public-oriented tone of her own and future royal weddings, and through her public appearances, such as at the Great Exhibition. Victoria's reign guided Britain through a tumultuous period of industrial, economic, technological, and social change. She had overseen huge expansion abroad and stability and growth at home, and her reign was remembered by the Victorians and their descendants as a golden age of British greatness. Yet in some ways, her legacy and the legacy of her era have become more contentious over time. As historians evaluate the cost of industrial progress and expansion abroad, the experiences of non-British subjects of the empire and the poor in Britain are now being included in the narrative of the Victorian age. Victoria's investiture as Empress of India and her role as leader of the empire complicate her legacy. Victoria and Albert's intention to promote peace in Europe by establishing a network of alliances through royal marriages represented another failure. Although Victoria was fondly known as the grandmother of Europe and had successfully married off her 9 children and 42 grandchildren into several royal European houses, war was not avoided. By the turn of the 20th century, Victoria's grandchildren were on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Denmark, Greece, Norway, Romania, and Spain. But her vision of a peaceful Europe was not to come to pass as her own grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, led Germany into war against Britain in 1914. Among her notable descendants, the 3 cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, and King Edward VII, have often been blamed by historians for the outbreak of the First World War. But Victoria and Albert's legacy lives on as their living descendants still sit on several European thrones. From her links to present-day monarchs to the history of the Victorian age that British children are taught at school, Victoria endures. The image of her as a stately old lady clad in her black mourning attire has defined her to this day. But a more complex image of Victoria and her era is coming to light. What do you think of Queen Victoria? Was she a passive woman dominated by powerful male advisors and far removed from the suffering of her people? Or was she a complex and intelligent ruler who did what she could within the limitations of a constitutional monarchy? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Queen Victoria's reign stretched over a period of 63.5 years. When she came to the throne, Britain was in the middle of the railway boom, and people still rode around London in carriages and lit their homes with lamps. When she died, the world had been electrified, and automobiles were about to replace horses on the streets of the world's great cities. Victoria's life changed immeasurably across the same 63-year period, and that was largely because of her husband. On February 10, 1840, she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was given the lesser title of Prince Albert so as not to overshadow her position as Queen Regnant. His early death 21 years later in 1861, at just 42 years of age, was an event from which she never fully recovered. Victoria famously took to wearing black mourning clothes for the rest of her life and pulled back from excessive public engagement. What was it about Albert that inspired this severe reaction in her? After all, most royal marriages were largely arranged for political and dynastic reasons prior to the 20th century. Why did Victoria develop such an attachment to Albert? Where had he come from? And what was his life like before he moved to Britain and married the Queen? On December 14th, 1861, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria of Britain, died at 42 years of age. This German royal consort had made his mark on British history, overseeing projects like the establishment of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Victoria was deeply affected by his death. She spent nearly 40 years constantly dressed in black, the color worn by mourning widows, and she never remarried. Who was Albert? The man who Victoria mourned so much and who influenced the cultural and political life of 19th century Britain, yet who is so frequently overlooked in accounts of Victorian Britain. This is the story of Prince Albert of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The man known to history as Prince Albert was born Franz August Karl Albert Emanuel to the ruling family of the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld on August 26, 1819, at Schloss Rosenau, near Coburg in central Germany. His father was Duke Ernst III of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. He was a member of the senior Ernestine branch of the House of Wettin, a German princely family whose Catholic cousins in the junior branch ruled as electors and kings of Saxony. Ernst had served in the campaigns that led to Napoleon Bonaparte's overthrow in 1814. In July 1817, he married his cousin, Princess Louise of Saxe-Altenburg, the only child of Duke Emil August, who ruled his duchy from the city of Gotha. The couple had two sons, Ernst and Albert, born in 1818 and 1819. At the time of Albert's birth, the European continent was at peace following 23 years of conflict in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Before Napoleon, the German lands were part of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling imperial entity ruled by the Habsburg dynasty from Vienna. Although the Habsburgs enjoyed full sovereignty over crown lands, such as Austria and Bohemia, by the late 18th century, they had little political power over the rest of Germany. In 1806, following his decisive victory over an Austro-Russian coalition army at Austerlitz in December 1805, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in western Germany. As master of Germany, Napoleon consolidated the hundreds of principalities into a few dozen more coherent entities. After his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Congress of Vienna could not undo his work and instead formed the German Confederation, a collection of some 40 states led by Austria. As a result of these changes, the surviving German dynasties became attractive prospects for European royal houses seeking marriages with princely houses. Saxe-Coburg was among the most ambitious of these families, and over the course of the 19th century, Saxe-Coburg descendants would rule in Belgium, Bulgaria, Russia, Portugal, and Britain. Dynastic ties between the Coburgs and the British royal family were first established in May 1816 when Albert's youngest uncle Leopold married Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate child of the future King George IV of the United Kingdom. Leopold was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars and was popular in London. However, before Charlotte could inherit the throne, she died from childbirth in November 1817. Her widowed husband returned to Coburg until 1831, when he accepted the crown of newly independent Belgium. Meanwhile, Charlotte's death left the Hanoverian dynasty at risk of extinction in Britain. George IV's younger brothers had been content to maintain a string of mistresses, but their niece's death led them to seek German wives to produce legitimate heirs. Even before Charlotte's demise, her youngest uncle, Edward, Duke of Kent, had his eye on Leopold's widowed sister, Victoria. The couple married in 1818, and in May 1819 the Duchess of Kent gave birth to a daughter named Alexandrina Victoria, the future Queen Victoria. A few months later, Victoria's future husband Albert was born at Schloss Rosenau, Duke Ernst's summer residence. Victoria and Albert's fate seemed to be linked from birth. Dr. Charlotte von Siebold, a renowned midwife, assisted at the birth of both babies. Albert was baptized by Pastor Gensler, the Lutheran cleric who had presided over the Duke and Duchess of Kent's wedding ceremony the previous May. Not long after Albert's birth, his parents' marriage began to fall apart. Ernst was frequently unfaithful, and to make up for her husband's neglect, Louise began flirting with other men, including her brother-in-law, Prince Leopold. It was subsequently rumored that Leopold was Albert's father, though this theory has never been proved. In 1822, Louise's father died aged 50, leaving his duchy to his younger brother Friedrich. He had been seriously wounded in the Napoleonic Wars and was not expected to live long. The potential succession of Ernst to the duchy when Friedrich died was complicated when Louise left Coburg in August 1824 and abandoned her family in disgust at her husband's affairs. Nevertheless, when Duke Friedrich of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg died in February 1825, Ernst inherited Gotha through Louise and divorced her shortly thereafter. Louise married a Prussian officer the following year, but died 5 years later in Paris. Louise's abrupt departure was undoubtedly a traumatic event in the childhood of the 5-year-old Albert, who remained with his father, now Duke Ernst I of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. While Ernst was a poor husband, he was a cultured man and made sure that his sons were well educated. When they were 4 years old, Ernst appointed Jan Christoph Florschutz as their tutor. The boys studied a wide range of subjects including English, French, Latin, Greek, history, mathematics, and science, as well as painting, music, and dancing. The two brothers were particularly close while growing up at Rosenau. By the time they were 10 years old, Ernst and Albert were sitting through 11 hours of lessons from Florschutz every day from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. While Albert would become highly accomplished in all subject areas, he particularly enjoyed his art and history lessons. In summer 1831, Duke Ernst traveled to London to visit his sister, the Duchess of Kent. The previous year, George IV had died and had been succeeded by his brother, King William IV. While there, Ernst discussed the prospect of his son Albert marrying Ernst's niece, Victoria, who was now heir to the British throne. Negotiations on this proposal continued for years to come. Meanwhile, in Germany, Ernst and Albert were being prepared for royal careers at a time when European monarchs were having their powers limited by constitutions and parliaments. In summer 1832, they went to Brussels to visit their uncle Leopold, who had become the first king of the Belgians after the Belgian Revolution of 1830. In 1836, Ernst and Albert were invited back to stay in Brussels for a year. Prior to their departure, Duke Ernst appointed Baron Friedrich Georg Christian von Richmond as their governor. An old soldier who had fought with the Hanoverians under the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, Richmond was tasked with keeping an eye on the boys. In May 1836, Leopold arranged for them to visit England for the first time. The visit had been prompted by King William IV's decision to invite Prince William of Orange and his sons William and Alexander to London with the intention of marrying Victoria off to a Dutch prince. Thankfully for the Coburgs, neither of the Dutch princes made much of an impression on the young Victoria. In a letter of the time, Albert described attending the celebration of Victoria's 17th birthday, during which he briefly exchanged pleasantries with the king, and also met with dignitaries such as the Duke of Wellington and Sir Robert Peel, the leader of the Conservative Party or Tories. In the same letter, Albert wrote about the ball that accompanied King William's 71st birthday and the trouble he had with the British climate and food. The Coburg princes stayed at Kensington Palace, the residence of Victoria and her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Victoria found her cousins Ernst and Albert far more interesting than the Dutch princes, and she described 16-year-old Albert as handsome. She informed her uncle Leopold that she was willing to marry him, although she did not consider herself bound to do so. Back in Brussels, Albert received a crash course in contemporary European politics from his uncle. Recently married to the daughter of King Louis-Philippe of France, Leopold offered insights into the legitimist and Bonapartist factions that challenged his Orleanist father-in-law, who had been brought to power in Paris by a liberal bourgeois revolution in 1830. In Central Europe, an uprising by Polish revolutionaries seeking to restore their independence had been crushed by the Russian Empire. While the German lands were in a tug-of-war between Protestant Prussia in the north and Catholic Austria in the south, the Austrian Habsburgs were also determined to defeat Italian aspirations for unification given Austrian control over northern Italy around Milan and Venice. Meanwhile, Spain was paralyzed by civil war between liberal and conservative factions. These revolutionary and nationalist impulses in Europe were accompanied by economic and technological change through the Industrial Revolution. After spending 10 months in Brussels in April 1837, Albert and Ernst enrolled at the University of Bonn, where they focused their studies on law, politics, and philosophy. A few weeks into his university studies, Albert learned of William IV's death and Victoria's accession in June 1837. While King Leopold and Duke Ernst hurried to London to press Albert's suit, in the autumn, the young princes went on a tour of southern Germany, the Swiss Alps, and Venice. In early 1838, they returned to Brussels where Leopold informed Albert that Victoria was in no hurry to marry. Instead, Albert would return to university, and the question of marriage would be revisited late in 1839. Albert dutifully returned to Bonn, where he studied German constitutional law under Professor Clemens Theodor Perthes, later a member of the Prussian House of Representatives, and philosophy under Emanuel Hermann Fichte, the son of Johann Gottlieb, an influential philosopher regarded as a father of German nationalism. In accordance with Leopold and Victoria's plans, after 3 semesters at Bonn, Albert prepared to embark on a grand tour of Italy in late 1838. He had to travel without his beloved brother Ernst, who went to the Saxon capital of Dresden for military training. After a difficult journey in the depths of winter, Albert arrived at Florence in January 1839, where he viewed the famed Medici art collections at the Uffizi Gallery and the Pitti Palace. In addition to the native Italian aristocracy, Florence was home to large numbers of Bonapartist and Polish exiles. Though Albert was bored by the constant round of balls and preferred to go walking in the mountains with Francis Seymour, an English officer whom Leopold had invited to come to Italy as Albert's traveling companion. After 3 months in Florence, the party moved on to Rome, where Albert marveled at the splendor of St. Peter's Basilica and discussed the collections of the Vatican Museum with Pope Gregory XVI. Albert's appreciation for Italian art increased under the guidance of Dr. Emil Braun, the secretary of the Prussian Archaeological Institute, who was part of a small community of German cultural intellectuals in Rome. Albert journeyed on to Naples and Pompeii before returning home. He was glad to be reunited with his father and brother in Switzerland ahead of his final summer at Rosenau. In early October, Albert and his brother went to London via Brussels to reinitiate marriage negotiations with Victoria. Although Albert had received reports that Victoria remained hesitant about the prospect of marriage, Victoria fell in love with him after his arrival at Windsor in October. Within days, she asked Albert to marry her. The Queen's announcement of her engagement to her Privy Council in November divided British political opinion. While the governing Whigs were in favor, the Tory opposition was concerned about a German consort. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, had promised Victoria that Parliament would grant Albert an annual allowance of £50,000, but the Tories reduced this to £30,000. Furthermore, Albert struggled to understand the expectations of British elites, and his request to bring his own entourage from Coburg was firmly denied by Melbourne and the Queen. Instead, Albert was obliged to take on Melbourne's private secretary, George Anson, as his own private secretary. After several days of festivities in Coburg and Gotha, Albert and his father and brother left Gotha on January 28th and passed through Belgium on their way to England. After arriving at London in February, Albert was named Field Marshal of the British Army. Victoria and Albert were then married on February 10th at St. James's Palace and spent a few days at Windsor before returning to London. Historians remain divided on the exact nature of their relationship. Some have portrayed their marriage as a fairy tale romance, but others argue that while Victoria was passionately in love with Albert, the latter regarded the marriage primarily as part of his duty to further his family's dynastic ambitions. In the weeks following his marriage, Albert came to recognize that the English were not expecting him to play an active role in political life and that he would have no formal title. Nevertheless, Albert was determined to establish a political identity independent of his wife. He chose to do so in a speech on June 1st, 1840, at Exeter Hall on the Strand, in which he urged the enforcement of the abolition of the slave trade in the Caribbean by military force if necessary. Meanwhile, Parliament passed the Regency Act to designate Albert as regent should Victoria die before the child, which she was carrying by then, reached their majority. On November 22nd, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Victoria or Vicky, who would be Albert's favorite child. At the same time, Albert was becoming more involved in the realm's politics. During her early reign, Queen Victoria had closely identified herself with Lord Melbourne's Whigs. Albert believed that the Queen should not be so partisan, but he was appalled by the way the Tories insulted her ministers. In June 1841, the royal couple visited the University of Oxford, where Albert received an honorary doctorate in civil law from the Duke of Wellington, the university's chancellor. The old war hero had entered politics after his retirement from the army and led a Tory administration as prime minister in the late 1820s. When Wellington invited Albert to attend the annual Waterloo banquet the following week, the prince snubbed him on account of the abuse the Tory students hurled at the Whig ministers during the ceremony. Albert's refusal was a political misstep, and he could not avoid encountering Wellington at other royal engagements. The mistake was more apparent after the Whigs were defeated by the Conservatives in the summer general election. By the time Victoria officially sanctioned Robert Peel's cabinet in September 1841, she was 7 months into her second pregnancy, which led to the birth in November of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales and the future Edward VII, known to the family as Bertie. The new prime minister found himself increasingly in communication with Albert on matters that required royal attention. Sir Robert was not only impressed by the prince's political judgment, but also pleasantly surprised to discover Albert's interest in literature and art. Peel accordingly appointed Albert to chair a royal commission to redecorate the new Palace of Westminster, seat of the Houses of Parliament, which was being rebuilt after a fire in 1834 that destroyed much of the medieval palace. While Melbourne had been Victoria's political mentor, Albert turned to Peel for guidance on English constitutional conventions. The Queen also gradually began to warm to Peel. In order to cover the budget deficit he inherited in 1842, the new prime minister revived the income tax that had previously been used to finance military expenditures during the Napoleonic Wars. The tax revenue enabled him to reduce tariffs on a wide range of imported goods, lowering costs for poorer families. Peel also proposed repealing the Corn Laws that protected agricultural interests, although the measure was defeated by conservative protectionists in the House of Commons. Peel believed that his policies were essential to protect the British Constitution from the wave of radicalism that was sweeping its way across Europe in the 1840s. The Victorian elites cloaked political and economic progress with reassuring throwbacks to the High Middle Ages, casting aside the neoclassicism inspired by Greece and Rome in favor of the Gothic, which was seen as a particularly English style of art and architecture. Accordingly, the new Palace of Westminster was being rebuilt by Sir Charles Barry and the brilliant Augustus Welby Pugin in the Gothic Revival style. Construction began in 1837 and carried on for 2 decades until the completion of the famous clock tower, known informally as Big Ben. By giving Albert responsibility over its decoration, Peel not only trusted the prince's artistic judgment, but kept him away from overt political matters. In many ways, the modus vivendi established between Peel, Victoria, and Albert created the modern constitutional monarchy in Britain. As a means of addressing concerns that he would import German artists to decorate the British Parliament, Albert launched a competition for drawings and frescoes that was only open to British artists. After the entrance work was exhibited at Westminster Hall in 1843 and 1844, 6 of the artists were commissioned to paint a series of murals on subjects ranging from Caesar's invasion of Britain to King Charles I's raising of his standard during the English Civil War. Away from Westminster, Albert would engage the Saxon artist Ludwig Gruner as his artistic advisor and the architect of several royal projects. Gruner's first commission for Albert was the Garden Pavilion at Buckingham Palace, inspired by the centerpiece of the Hofgarten in Munich. The structure, which no longer survives, indicates that although Albert was settling into British political life, he continued to see the world through German eyes. As constitutional monarchs, Victoria and Albert played a prominent role on the diplomatic front with foreign visits. In 1843, shortly after the birth of their daughter Alice, the royal couple crossed the Channel to meet with King Louis-Philippe of France at the Château d'Eu in Normandy. Britain and France had recently been involved in a century-long struggle for global hegemony, which ended in 1815 with a coalition victory over Napoleon at Waterloo. The old rivals had become friendlier in recent decades, and politicians on both sides of the Channel identified shared foreign policy interests. The royal visit proved a success, and the couple would be invited to the chateau again 2 years later. In November, Albert accompanied Peel on a visit to the factories in Birmingham. The industrial city was a hotbed of radical politics, and politicians in Westminster were concerned about Albert's safety since the royal couple had been targeted by assassins in London the previous year. Despite such fears, the prince was cheered in the streets and became increasingly popular among the masses. Albert's efforts to establish himself in British society prevented him from visiting his German homeland. When he did return home, it was sadly for the funeral of his father, who had died on January 29, 1844. Albert traveled to Coburg and stayed with his brother, now Duke Ernst II of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, where they attended a service at the city church where their father had recently been buried. While Victoria and Albert spent most of their time at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, they longed for a summer retreat outside London. The couple had stayed a few times at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, but neither was fond of the eclectic Oriental style conceived there by George IV as Prince Regent. They soon abandoned the property after Peel helped to broker the purchase of Osborne House overlooking the northern coast of the Isle of Wight. They commissioned the architect Thomas Cubitt to demolish the old house and replace it with a grander Italianate design conceived by Albert. Albert also designed the layout of the gardens and collaborated on the interior design with Ludwig Gruner. As the royal couple oversaw this work, the country was at a political and economic crossroads as Peel attempted to abolish the Corn Laws. The debate had fundamental repercussions on British society. Advocates of repeal tended to be political and economic liberals who supported free trade and the development of industry. Many middle-class businessmen were making large fortunes from trade, which translated into growing political power. From an economic perspective, there was no question that Britain would be better off by shifting towards higher-value industrial production and importing food from abroad. Supporters of the status quo were typically large landowners with agricultural estates who wanted to keep food prices high. To worsen Peel's predicament, a few months later, news reached London that the potato crop had failed in Ireland, leaving much of the island's population with little to eat. Peel was aware of the magnitude of the problem and proposed relief efforts, but he was opposed by his cabinet. Peel resigned in response, but he was forced to stay in office after Whig leader Lord John Russell failed to form a new administration. Albert observed proceedings in the Commons Gallery in January when Peel introduced his proposals to reduce and abolish duties on a whole range of imports, including corn, prompting vociferous attacks from his own benches. After 5 months of debate, the measure passed thanks to overwhelming support from the opposition Whigs. The Tory hardliners exacted their revenge on Peel by voting with the Radicals and Irish nationalists against the Irish Coercion Bill, intended to keep order on the island as the famine worsened. The minority Peelites Conservatives subsequently allied with the Whigs to form the New Liberal Party. The repeal of the Corn Laws did little to improve matters for the Irish people, as the potato crop failed for a second year in 1846. Lord Russell's government organized limited relief efforts that failed to prevent the death of 1 million people between 1845 and 1852. Aside from his colonialist views that were typical of the British political establishment, Albert enjoyed a reputation as a liberal and a man of learning. This prompted the Master of Trinity College to propose his candidacy as Chancellor of the University of Cambridge following the death of the Duke of Northumberland in February 1847. Albert agreed to put his name forward. The prince was officially inaugurated as Chancellor at Buckingham Palace in March. While the post of Chancellor was largely an honorary position with limited executive functions, Albert would play an active role in the university's administration. With his experience of German university education, Albert recognized that there was much room for improvement at Cambridge, whose students were destined for the law or the church, and teaching was largely restricted to mathematics and classics. In November 1847, Albert reported to Russell that the range of subjects should be expanded. While Russell was cautious about pushing forward with university reform, Cambridge began offering courses in the natural and moral sciences. In 1848, Albert's patronage inspired similar reforms at Oxford. 1848 would prove to be one of the most consequential years in European history as a wave of revolutions swept across Europe. Revolutionary activity in Paris forced King Louis-Philippe to abdicate in February and flee to England. In March, Victoria gave birth to her sixth child, a daughter named Louise after Albert's mother, while Albert drafted a plan for a united Germany, which he sent to the courts of Vienna, Berlin, Dresden, and Munich. In reality, he had little power to influence events in Germany, where a national assembly in Frankfurt proposed a German empire with the King of Prussia as its emperor and all the other German sovereigns as his vassals. The proposal horrified Victoria and Albert, as it would entail the subjugation of their German cousins under Prussian rule. In the end, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia rejected the offer of an imperial crown. The royal couple were also anxious about the security of their own crowns, as London witnessed weeks of rioting by the Chartists who demanded universal suffrage and greater rights for the working class. Albert was sympathetic to radical causes and had agreed to become the president of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Laboring Classes, a philanthropic organization to provide better housing for working-class Englishmen. He had previously supported legislation in Parliament to increase the minimum age for children to work in mines and reduce working hours to 10 hours a day. Such initiatives were designed to correct the excesses of free market capitalism while avoiding the socialist ideology of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who published their Communist Manifesto in London in February 1848. For all his influence as a patron of social housing and a university reformer, Albert resented his lack of genuine political power, which was denied him by Lord John Russell and his Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Albert saw Palmerston's encouragement of Italian, Polish, and Hungarian revolutionaries in 1848 as deeply irresponsible. Albert enjoyed greater discretion on purely royal matters, such as the development of the royal retreat at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The Deeside estate had been leased by the diplomat Sir Robert Gordon, who died in 1847 after choking on a fishbone. Gordon was the younger brother of the 4th Earl of Aberdeen, who had recently served as Peel's Foreign Secretary and was friendly with the royal couple. As one of his late brother's trustees, Aberdeen was keen to offload Balmoral and knew that Victoria and Albert were fond of Scotland after their first trip there in 1842. Albert agreed to take on the lease, and in September 1848, the royal family made their first visit to Balmoral. The couple were happy to be back on Scottish soil and enjoyed the privacy it offered. During the rare spells of good weather, Albert enjoyed hunting on the grounds. While in Scotland, they received news of an Irish uprising in the counties of Wexford and Waterford, but this did not deter them from undertaking a royal visit to Ireland in August 1849. While there, Victoria and Albert inaugurated the new Queen's University of Ireland, made up of constituent colleges in the cities of Belfast, Cork, and Galway. Unlike Trinity College Dublin, which was solely reserved for Anglican Protestants, the new institution admitted Catholics. Although Albert was impressed by the learning and moderation of the Catholic clergy in Ireland, the royal couple were caught up in renewed anti-Catholic sentiment in England after Pope Pius IX authorized the creation of 12 Catholic dioceses in England. Albert considered the move an existential threat to the Church of England, and Parliament passed a bill making Catholic ecclesiastical titles illegal. Though the legislation was never enforced, on May 1, 1850, Victoria gave birth to her 7th child and 3rd son. Since the prince was born on the 81st birthday of the Duke of Wellington, he was named Arthur after the elderly Duke, who was one of his godparents. While Victoria and Albert were seeking to situate themselves above the nation's political battles in Parliament, they continued to urge Russell to dismiss Palmerston from the Foreign Office. Palmerston's conduct had irritated a number of foreign governments, and the royal couple were particularly concerned about his stance on the Schleswig-Holstein question. The predominantly German-speaking duchies of Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg were ruled by the King of Denmark, but were constitutionally distinct from the Kingdom of Denmark. In 1848, the Prussian-led German Confederation declared war on Denmark. The Danes would prevail in a 3-year conflict, but Victoria and Albert worried that Palmerston's support for Denmark was antagonizing the German powers, arguing that British foreign policy should be guided by British national interests. Palmerston defended himself from critics in a lengthy parliamentary speech in June 1850. A few days later, Robert Peel died after falling from his horse, depriving the royal couple of a trusted confidant. Meanwhile, the Queen and Albert continued to express their dissatisfaction with Palmerston's foreign policy. The Foreign Secretary temporarily survived in office, but was forced to resign in December 1851 after sending a private telegraph congratulating Prince Louis Napoleon, who had been elected president of the Second French Republic in 1848, on the coup d'état that ultimately led to him becoming Emperor Napoleon III of France. While Albert was plotting against Palmerston, he was also working on a grand project to promote British industry. Although the Industrial Revolution was making Britain wealthy, industrialization was opposed by many people across the political spectrum, from hardline conservative grandees who resented the desecration of the English countryside to labor agitators who highlighted the exploitation of workers by the new industrial bosses. Albert embraced industrial growth, and since 1843 had been president of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. From 1845, several prominent society members began discussing plans for a national exhibition of British arts and manufactures along the lines of the palace expositions that had been held sporadically since the early 1800s. The idea was first suggested by telegraph pioneer William Fothergill Cooke and soon received the backing of liberal politician Charles Wentworth Dilke and Henry Cole, a civil servant credited with the invention of the postage stamp and Christmas card. By 1849, the Society announced its ambition to hold a British national exhibition in 1851 and established a committee chaired by Cole for the purpose. Albert recognized that the exhibition combined his interests in art and technology and agreed to be its patron in June 1849. He quickly assumed a leading role in its organization and became president of the Royal Commission for the exhibition of 1851. The prince believed that it should not only showcase British products, but should be an international event promoting free trade and the unity of mankind. He led the fundraising for the project and traveled throughout the country to appeal to bankers and merchants. One of the Royal Commission's most important tasks was the construction of the exhibition building. While many different sites across London were discussed, Hyde Park was the obvious choice for the venue, although the suggestion faced opposition in Parliament and in the press. In spring 1850, the Commission set up a building committee, including luminaries like the engineers Kingdom Brunel and Robert Stephenson. Since all the proposals they received were deemed unsuitable, the committee devised a squat brick structure crowned by a massive iron dome designed by Brunel. The proposal horrified Joseph Paxton, a gardener and architect known for his work on the Duke of Devonshire's landscape garden at Chatsworth House. Paxton had built a great conservatory made from standardized glass panes supported by a structure of iron and wood, and his familiarity with the construction techniques led him to draw up plans for a vast glass building 6 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral that would cost only £88,000 to build. After the building committee's design was publicly ridiculed, the commission accepted Paxton's proposal in July with Albert's backing. The prefabricated structure, nicknamed the Crystal Palace, was completed by February 1851. English manufacturers responded eagerly to the opportunity to exhibit their wares to the world, some of which were personally commissioned by Albert. Large collections were being assembled from Persia, China, the United States, and other parts of the world for what would become an iconic event in the history of the British Empire. Ahead of the exhibition's opening, there were concerns about the threat of violence against visiting dignitaries by various groups of political dissidents. Since the Queen was due to open the exhibition, the organizers planned to restrict the opening ceremony to the diplomatic corps, but the royal couple pressed for a less exclusive event. As Albert's wife opened the exhibition on May 1st, 1851, the Queen was struck by the magnificence of the Crystal Palace and its interior decoration. She accompanied Albert past an audience of 24,000 onlookers without any issue. Victoria would return to the exhibition over 30 times, and the event attracted over 6 million visitors in the 5.5 months between May and October 1851. For all of Albert's idealistic notions of universal peace and prosperity, the event was also a statement of British imperial power, as one of its most popular exhibits was the Kohinoor diamond seized from the 11-year-old Maharaja, Dalip Singh, in 1849 and presented to the Queen in 1850. The exhibition's ticket sales generated a profit of £186,000, which Albert used to finance the construction of a cultural complex to the south of Hyde Park, nicknamed Albertopolis. The prince personally inspected the ground where building work was to take place and offered advice on the interior decoration of the South Kensington Museum, which opened in June 1857 and was later rebuilt as the Victoria and Albert Museum. To consolidate his legacy as a patron of the arts, Albert launched an initiative in 1853 to document every single work of art by the Renaissance master Raphael, building on the collection of prints inherited from George III and George IV. Like the Raphael collection, Albert's vision of Albertopolis was only realized after his death. The Royal College of Chemistry, founded in 1845 and patronized by Albert, merged with the Royal School of Mines in 1853 and moved to South Kensington in 1872 to form the core of Imperial College London. The Royal Albert Hall, the concert venue dedicated by Victoria to Albert's memory, was inaugurated in 1871. The Natural History Museum opened in 1881 and the Royal College of Music in 1883. Albert was one of Britain's great royal patrons of art and culture. In September 1852, during Victoria and Albert's annual visit to Balmoral, the couple received news of the Duke of Wellington's death. Albert organized the Duke's state funeral, a grand spectacle during which the late Duke's body was transported in a funeral carriage from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea to the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. The victory at Waterloo had brought Britain and Europe several decades of relative peace and tranquility. But Wellington recognized that the British Army needed reform at the dawn of an age of industrialized warfare. A few years earlier, the Duke had suggested that Albert should succeed him as commander-in-chief and lead the necessary reforms. Albert declined, and Wellington was succeeded by the uninspiring Lord Hardinge, an old soldier who had served under Wellington during the Napoleonic Wars, and had been Governor-General of India a few years earlier. The restoration of the French Empire by Napoleon III prompted fears of renewed hostilities with France, England's perennial enemy. While the specter of war was indeed on the horizon, British and French soldiers would fight side by side when it broke out. The spark for this was the outbreak of a fresh war between the Russian and Ottoman empires during their long-running rivalry in the Black Sea, Caucasus, and Balkans. The Russian Black Sea Fleet sank an Ottoman squadron at Sinope on the northern coast of Turkey in November 1853. As the war developed, concerns grew in London and Paris that the Russians would seize Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, inflaming British opinion. While Albert believed Britain could secure its foreign policy objectives without going to war, the popular Palmerston, back in government as Home Secretary, demanded action. After formally joining the war against Russia in March 1854, in September nearly 60,000 British and French troops landed on the Crimean Peninsula and laid siege to the port of Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Meanwhile, Albert met with Napoleon III in France to consolidate the alliance between the former rivals. The Crimean War soon highlighted the inadequacies of both armies. Public opinion quickly turned against the war as war reporters and photographers documented the death, destruction, and incompetence of the Allied military leadership, exemplified by the infamous charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava. In January 1855, the Queen reluctantly acknowledged that only Palmerston could command a parliamentary majority as Prime Minister. After Sevastopol finally fell in September 1855, the new Russian Tsar Alexander II sued for peace, which was signed in March 1856. Although the British and French had temporarily prevented Russia's expansion into the Balkans, both sides suffered awful casualties. To recognize the courageous exploits of individual soldiers in February 1856, Victoria instituted the Victoria Cross with the inscription "For Valor." The performance of the respective armies in the Crimean War provided vital intelligence to the Prussians, who determined that Britain would be incapable of resisting a further armed attempt to resolve the Schleswig-Holstein question in their favor. While the war was ongoing, Victoria and Albert received Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia at Balmoral in 1855. The 23-year-old prince was the nephew of the childless Prussian king and would eventually succeed to the throne as Friedrich III. Victoria and Albert were determined that their eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, would marry the Prussian prince. Friedrich's visit in 1855 formalized their engagement, and the couple were married in January 1858. A few months before the wedding of her eldest daughter, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Beatrice, the last of her 9 children. While the Queen's regular pregnancies indicated that the couple were passionately devoted to each other, the royal couple were also prone to frequent arguments, and Albert struggled to cope with Victoria's mood swings. In the royal household, Albert was an absolute monarch, even though he had no. Several decades later, the subjects of Albert's grandsons, Kaiser Wilhelm II and King George V, were facing each other across the blood-stained battlefields of the First World War. What do you think of Prince Albert? Does he deserve his reputation as a liberal reformer who patronized the arts and sciences and brought the British royal family into the modern age? Or was he too naive in seeking to forge European unity through dynastic alliances in an age of nationalism? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the History Profile for more great documentaries. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had 9 children before Albert's premature passing in 1861. Although his early death meant that he never met most of them, the couple eventually had 42 grandchildren and 87 great-grandchildren. The figure runs into the hundreds for subsequent generations of their descendants. The sheer size of the family they started was captured in the family of Queen Victoria, a huge painting that was produced by the Danish painter Lit Stuxen in 1887 to commemorate her golden jubilee that year. There are 53 people in the picture. Their children, grandchildren, and other descendants would go on to rule Britain, Germany, Norway, Romania, Greece, Spain, and several of the smaller German principalities, while they were related through marriage to almost every single European royal family. It is not an exaggeration to describe the couple as the grandmother and grandfather of Europe. And yet that was a difficult legacy, too. It meant that the hemophilia that Victoria was a dormant carrier of spread around Europe's royal families, and that when the continent went to war in 1914, it pitched cousin against cousin. None of that can have been foreseen when a 20-year-old queen married a 20-year-old consort at the Chapel Royal on the 10th of February, 1840. Their union was to shape Europe's royal politics for the next century.